Hi there, my name is Ian Heath, also known in the LEGO community as Ochre. For the past 7 years or so I've focused on character-based LEGO creations, which you can see on my Flickr stream here. For the past 4 years or so I've also been running a website called thelivingbrick.com, which showcases the best character-based LEGO creations from builders all around the world. Now I've always wanted to properly document one of my builds, and try and show my build process, and I finally accomplished this in November during the creation of my Hobbit figures. Now, I'd originally planned to do this as a blog post, but I figured it'd end up being like the most tedious post ever. So then it occurred to me it'd be much more fun as a YouTube video. Bilbo and Gollum here are examples of a system I've been developing over the past 2 years, where a 1 foot model represents a 6 foot individual, or in the case of these guys, a 3 foot individual. This larger scale offers more detailed realism than Miniland scale, and the 3 stud wide head is just the right proportion to the body, which lets me get some really nice facial detail in there as well. So let's begin. This is a frame from one of the trailers from the new Hobbit movie. This represents the scene I originally wanted to create in some form. In the end I was only able to manage the characters. I ditched the idea of a cave diorama entirely. As far as what characters and what moment I wanted to recreate from the trilogy, this was the obvious choice in my mind. The encounter between Bilbo and Gollum kind of represents a pivotal moment in the whole Tolkien canon in my opinion, and it's also one of the most well-known scenes as well. The plan was to get the models finished to coincide with the movie's release in December, so immediately after BritCon, which is in October, I got straight to work. Of course, one of the problems with trying to model characters from a movie that hasn't come out yet is it's really hard to find good reference material. I had the same problem with my Quora figure from Tron. I had no idea exactly how they would stage Bilbo finding the ring in the movie, so I decided not to worry about that. I just came up with this imagined scene that you saw in the previous image, which I thought would capture the emotional states of both characters quite well. So this is where it all begins. I usually build a posable stick figure with rough proportions, and then experiment with this to figure out the exact pose I want. The stuff in front there is just me working out the overall colour palette of the model. These have ball and socket joints, so they're very flexible, but the final models won't be reposable at all, which is why it's important for me to decide the pose really early on. A lot of people use articulated joints to create character models, so they can just build it first and then pose it later, but in my experience the gaps left by these joints just make them look like mannequins. So the joints in my models are all set in place, and then I sculpt over them with bricks to hide the joints so they look completely solid and filled in. Here I've got Bilbo's basic pose down. He's holding up the ring, and Gollum's resting on one hand because I figured he'd never stay standing up any other way. Here's the next iteration. Bilbo's stance is less actiony and more pensive now, and Gollum's down on one knee for some reason. He looks really crazy in this one. And this is close to the final pose, with Gollum sort of squatting unassisted and looking up at Bilbo, holding the ring. Now I like to have as much reference material as possible to work from, taken from different angles and so on. I just researched it online and print it out, stick it to the wall above my work area like this. This guy's one of several stencils I use to keep my 12-inch scale figures in proportion. As you can see, this one is an adult male in profile, and it shows the bone structure and the major muscle groups. I actually based these on diagrams from an art manual. The stick next to him is just me trying to figure out where the various different coloured parts of Bilbo begin and end vertically, the hair, the face, the shirt, the pants, so on. You can see that my approach to building is studs forward, so I can use the thinness of the plates to capture all the curves of the body. And it's sort of pixelated. I tend not to use a lot of sloped or curved bricks because typically they don't offer the exact slope or curve that I need. Now this profile only represents one of 3 possible dimensions I'm sculpting in, and the challenge is to get the outline worked out in all 3 dimensions and then getting it all to kind of mesh together. The legs are usually the easiest part of the model, so I just get these out of the way first. Big hobbit feet in this case. No hair. I played around with various ways of doing the foot hair, and they all sucked, so I thought it wasn't an important detail in this scale, so I just left that out. The legs are going to support the weight of the rest of the model, so it's important to build them to be strong, which can be tricky given that they're also pretty thin, made out of plates, and in this case there's colour changes that are worked in there as well. This is the first cut of an entire body for Bilbo. As you can see, it's pretty crude. The goal is just to frame out the model, figure out where the various parts begin and end, and how long they need to be. And as you can imagine, the whole thing is a very iterative process. This is the first real build of the torso, sitting on top of those finished legs. So here I'm starting to sculpt the chest using tiles and map out the edges of the overcoat. And on the table in front is the next iteration of the torso where most of the work takes place. You can see the top's enlarged to represent the shoulders and the rib cage, and slopes back from the top of the rib cage towards the neck. I typically have to rebuild the torso completely 5 or 6 times over for a model like this. Each rebuild factors in the set of changes in such a way that the whole thing's still strong and stable. You know, if your model gets too fragile because you keep adding and adding, it becomes impossible to add any more because the thing just keeps exploding in your hands. Now it's actually starting to look recognisable. I've added more detail in the upper torso, around the shirt, the vest, the shoulders. The head's still just a placeholder at this point. This also shows my first attempt at sculpting the sides of the coat. Here they're just at right angles to the body, straight down the sides, all rather flat and boxy. So to get the coat to curve nicely around the body, I devised a system of alternating hinge bricks along and inside both sides of the torso. A bunch of beams attached to the hinges to create 2 angled planes that in turn are going to hold the dark red coat tiles in place. The fun bit was figuring out how to cram this bank of hinges inside the body and still keep the 2 halves securely anchored together. It's pretty tricky deciding how to capture the V shape of the green vest. There's a bunch of techniques you can use. In the end I went for a simple pixelated approach, which I use a lot, since it was the least complex and easiest to integrate with the rest of the model and didn't leave any sort of weird gaps. Plus I needed to set this section at a sloping backward angle. Note the ball and socket joints for the arms at this point. They're potentially very good for this, quite close to how our limbs actually attach to our bodies. Trouble is, they can be a pain to sculpt over, and they take up a lot of space inside the torso, and they don't come in very many colours. Which is why, in the next iteration, I got rid of them, in favour of simple hinge plates. Of course, the hinge plates only articulate in one direction, but you'll see how I remedy that in a bit, and how I get the hinge for the neck in that position as well. Here, though, you can see how the chest cavity got re-engineered to hold the vest/shirt piece at the correct angle and meshed nicely with the lower part of the vest. Now we're starting to build up parts of the coat around the chest and arm sockets and shoulders. This is where it starts to get tricky, getting the layers of plates at odd angles to one another and to smoothly mesh together. Now it's time to do the head. This scale of figure uses a 3-stud wide head, so the eyes can be just the right distance apart, and there's a lot of snot work to build out the sides of the head and the ears. Here from left to right you can see the progression of this process as I try different approaches and then discard them. Now one key to a believable head are cheekbones and the way the eye sockets are recessed above them. People often overlook the features of the human face like this and create faces that look very flat. So does it look like Martin Freeman yet? I don't know. I think this is probably the smallest scale you can do faces at and still capture something of the actual person it's based on. Here's a look inside the chest cavity to see how the head and neck are attached and angled by combining different types of hinges to create a sort of uber hinge that can move in more than one direction at once without taking up too much space. At this point the torso is basically done, so it's time to start figuring out the arms, which begins with posing. The arms here are just placeholders, so I can figure out the angles that I'm going to connect the real ones to the body. About this technique for creating the fingers, it's not my own. It's been used by a lot of other builders in the past. Each finger is actually a minifig arm and hand attached using the fig hand. By rotating the wrist joints on the minifig hands, you can create a whole variety of finger poses, such as this pinching effect here. This is a bit embarrassing. So I do this quite a lot actually. I stand in front of a mirror, or nowadays in front of my fancy new iPad, and I repeat the pose I'm trying to create so I can stay on model. Like here with Bilbo's left arm, I had a devil of a time getting it to hang in a natural looking way, even though it was in the right physical proportions. Okay, this image is a bit out of sequence. Here's a closer look at the magic that I mentioned earlier to get the arms to pose at the right angle without using those bulky ball and socket joints. It's basically the same as combining 2 hinges into one, except in this case it's a single hinge combined with a 1-stud connection to allow it to be angled up and down. My god, this hand was a nightmare. For the forearm, the wrist and the palm and the fingers all had to be at different angles or it didn't look natural. Just deciding on those angles was, I think, half the battle. Then I actually had to figure out a way to engineer it so everything connected at those angles and the arm would sort of look smooth and continuous and not fall apart. In the end, the trick was to bend the wrist, but then sculpting up the coat sleeves to cover the gaps meant this one arm took me 4 hours to complete. So once the arms are attached and in their final positions and filled out sufficiently, I can begin the final arduous task of adding all these little bricks around the connection points. And these serve two purposes. Firstly, just to fill in the gaps, and secondly, to add extra support to sort of lock the arm joints in place so they don't flop around or fall down under their own weight. This process really does feel like sculpting with clay or something like that. And looks like my sand-green tiles had arrived in the mail at this point, so the vest is no longer in that light grey colour. And here's Bilbo, all finished, next to the original mannequin that we started with. The gold ring is just from the standard Lord of the Rings sets. I thought it was going to be a struggle to get it to stay in between the fingers, but in the end I found that I could rotate them to just the right angle that the ring would snap into place. Of course, if you look behind him on the table, you'll see a bag of extra rings. That's in case the main one popped out during some convention. Okay, now on to Gollum. I built these two guys sort of in parallel. I find this saves time than doing one after the other, because often you get fed up or stuck with one, you just need to switch to the other to keep the momentum and the interest going. The pair of figures probably represent about 60 man-hours of effort in total. These are some early head designs. Big problem I had with Gollum was what colour to make him. None of the obvious choices of Lego colour seemed quite right, and as you'll see at the end, I actually came up with a novel solution to this particular problem. This is not that far from the final head design. Notice the worried frown, which I captured with a couple of upside down cheese slopes. And this is Gollum's torso. It's way simpler than Bilbo's. He has spindly limbs, so I figured simpler attachments would be sufficient, and he's got no clothes to speak of. It's all bone and muscle and nipples and belly button, so this was a pretty quick and easy build. This is one design I came up with for attaching the legs. I wanted to be able to angle them just right and still have it strong enough to support the weight of the rest of the model. Unfortunately, this design didn't hold up, but this one worked out really well. It's 3 Travis bricks, locked tight between a pair of Technic lift arms. This sits now at the bottom of the torso where the middle Travis brick's attached, and I sink a lightsaber brick right through it too later on to add more strength. All of the weight and the stress of the model channels through this region, so it has to be super strong. The neck was basically just a series of hinge plates with other stuff slapped on for effect. But it took a lot of work to fill in the gaps just right and get it all smooth but muscular. I'm really pleased with how it turned out. The jaw actually ended up becoming an integral part of the neck rather than the head, and the rest of the head just snaps onto the jaw. On the left here are the finished legs and hip unit, and on the right is another pass at getting the pose worked out using my original mannequin. I thought I'd have to make him sort of put one hand out on the ground for support because the weight of the head and the leaning forward stance really throw off the centre of gravity, but in the end that wasn't necessary. The final body's just very carefully balanced, and I do have one small transparent rod at the back for a little extra added support. Gollum's limbs needed to be thinner than the ones I normally do at this scale, so instead of being 2 studs wide, they're 1 stud wide. It's just a series of plates stacked up to create a profile of the leg, and then some long tiles attached along the sides to sort of add some girth. The hard part, sinking connector bricks into the legs to allow this kind of snot work, but doing it in such a way as to keep the legs strong enough to support the weight of the model. The ankle there is another lightsaber blade going through it to keep everything sort of locked together between the foot and the calf. Here's a shot of my workspace during the build. At some point the layer of bricks gets thick enough on the table I can't see the colour of the table underneath. I sometimes stop and I'll do a sort of mini sort, spend an hour or two just rapidly sorting out the mess of bricks, just so I can find the bricks I need more easily and so on. As I mentioned before, it was hard choosing colour for Gollum. One thing I experimented with was paint. I went out and got some modeller's spray paints in some paler versions of the Lego tan and grey, and I tested them on different colours of underlying bricks, such as black and white. I was never really happy with the results. It's hard to get good coverage without also causing the paint to pool up and obscure the detail, or without just leaving shadows where the paint doesn't land at all. So I abandoned the whole idea of using paint. I did consider trying an airbrush, but it seemed like a big money investment with no guarantee of a good result. So I didn't use that either. So instead of paint, I used a different technique to give Gollum his proper clammy skin tone. This is a before and after shot. Plain white bricks on the left, recolor version on the right. And no, this isn't Photoshop, and it's not paint either. I'm not going to reveal how I did it just yet. That'll be the subject of a future post on my blog, The Living Brick. It's a pretty cool trick, as I think you'll find. It'll blow your mind. Anyway, I love how the subtle off-white pink colour makes him look less ghost-like than the pure white version and allows the whites of his eyes to really stand out. The eyeballs, by the way, are minifig heads. And each one has a small trans blue round plate on top of it for the iris. And then I just use a Sharpie to draw in the pupil. After finishing the models, I actually went back and gave Gollum some hair, since he's going to be showing up at a few conventions. The hair's just some thick strands of thread, and I attached them by just popping off the skull cap and then reattaching them to sort of pinch them in place. And here he is with a fine head of hair. He doesn't seem too happy about it though. There's just no cheering this guy up. So when the models are all finished, all that remains is to photograph them. I can just shoot in my workroom, since the house's previous owner must have been a graphic designer or something, because there's this big rack of halogen lamps mounted in the ceiling which provide a lot of light, which is good for building too. I just add a bit of diffuse light from the side when I need to, using workman's lamps covered with some oven baking paper. The models will just sit on an old picture frame that's on top of a piano stand. I finally got a DSLR camera recently to replace my point and shoot. It's great because it works really well in low light conditions indoors. With my old camera, I found I often had to basically shoot outdoors on my deck on a cloudy day to get good light, which actually is a really good light source. It's very even and diffuse. You just have to contend with gusts of wind blowing everything down the garden half the time. This is the crazy light rack I was talking about. This was a final test of the positioning of the two models for the signature shot, with the ring in the foreground and then the eye lines of the characters sort of converging, drawing a line through it. And Bilbo looks fascinated with his new find, and Gollum obviously is completely mortified. And here's the final shot based on that pose, with a watermark added. There's a lot of image thieves out there who'll just repost your images and copy them and never give you credit. So if you want to see other shots of these two models, just check out my Flickr photo stream. There's some more there. So that's it. Complete, thorough breakdown of my build process. Thanks for listening and watching. And remember to check my blog, thelivingbrick.com. And in the near future, I'm going to post that article on how I achieved the magical colour change effect on Gollum's skin. Catch you later, dudes!